Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Ian Rowe, and I'm pinch hitting in this segment for Hannah Smith, who's a school board member down in Texas who unfortunately was not able to make it today. So I'm honored to be in her stead because in addition to the things that Charles just said, yes, I had the journey of running for school board. So I thought I'd just spend the next 30 minutes talking about that journey. And truthfully, if there are really, I think, two roles in the fight that I think we're all collectively involved in. And one is that you should run for school board, or you should support outstanding candidates for school board, because school boards are where the action is as it relates to all the issues we care about, but on a local basis where you can have face-to-face conversations about what all of this means for kids. And I think the more that we ground all of our work in what it means for kids, the more hopefully we can reduce some of the tension and just follow common sense. If you had asked me a year ago, would I be on the school board, I would have told you not. As Charles said, for the last 10 years, I ran a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan, mostly low-income kids, Black and Hispanic kids, who all just wanted a shot at the American dream. We had 2,500 kids in our schools. We had nearly 5,000 kids on the wait list, all just parents who just wanted their kids to do well. Fighting for school choice. I mean, this is a district in the South Bronx where only 2% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. So these are real issues to create opportunity and upward mobility for kids. So I did that for 10 years, and as Charles said, and those were elementary and middle schools, and now I'm launching a new network of international baccalaureate high schools that are opening up in the Bronx next year. So I'm all about kids. I'm all about creating opportunity. And in my own personal life, my wife and I, we had our first child, and then we had our second child in 2011. And we exercised our privilege and made the choice to move to a small town in Westchester, New York. And we moved there because it's great schools, small town, wonderful. But my attention was really on the school system I was leading, not the school system for my own two children. But over the last couple of years, I've started to see a shift. And really last year was, when COVID first hit and all schools were scrambling, we just didn't, we weren't that satisfied, frankly, with what we were hearing from the school district in terms of what they were going to do to best educate our kids with remote learning and all these different hybrid situations. So we connected, my wife and I connected with 10 other parents, and we created a pod. We hired a teacher and a part-time arts teacher, and we created this lovely little school for my son and 5 other boys. We had this lovely little school in this self-contained situation, and it was a beautiful year. And our daughter, actually we decided to keep our daughter because at her middle school level, it seemed like they had a pretty good plan. But on one level, I didn't feel great leaving the system. Like I'm not I've run charter schools, but I want to improve outcomes for everyone. I don't want to be someone who exits the system. I want to be someone who tries to make it better for everyone. So did that, and but again, that I wasn't thinking of running for school board. I just knew ultimately we wanted to bring our son back into the traditional system. But then earlier this year, or late last year, the school system decided to commission what's called an equity audit. And that, I've seen these things across the country, and I'm generally skeptical of them, right? But like with everything, you have to be open mind. Let's see what the end product is. And when the end product was delivered for our town, it literally read like a document that had predetermined conclusions before it was even researched, because some of the things that were said about the town just didn't seem to ring true. And they had definitions, like for example, equity, a portion of it meant, equitable outcomes. Like, equitable outcomes, what does that actually mean? I have two children, my wife and I have two children, they're two different kids, and there's no way that my own two children are gonna have equitable outcomes, right? And they're same parents, same household, same parenting, and they're just different. So why would we wanna set that as a goal for an entire system? And that's what this document was seemingly seeking to achieve. And when I looked at the data in the report, it was a very small sample of people who were interviewed, and they were separated into BIPOC. Many people don't know. Some people think the original definition of BIPOC was bisexual people of color, which is interesting. But one it was like feedback from BIPOC and feedback from white, as if there's just a single opinion from these two categories of people, and the numbers of folks that were involved were just seemingly very limited, and it just didn't feel right. When I looked at the data presentation, there was information about suspension rates that literally made it seem like the suspension rates for black boys was 4 times what it actually was, based on the way they presented the graphs. And again, just pointing these things out. And then also one of the recommendations in the name of equity was to do something called the Princeton Plan. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that, but the Princeton Plan is, without going into detail, imagine your neighborhood elementary schools. Like we have elementary schools in each one of our neighborhoods. Imagine those, instead of being organized by neighborhood, are organized by grade. So imagine all kindergarten students across the entire town all were in one physical building, and then all the first and second graders across town were all in another separate building, all your third and fourth graders in another building, and then all fifth graders in another building. So if you just think about that for a second, because the idea was we want all kids to get the same education in the name of equity, as opposed to why not just have exceptional education at each school, regardless of the racial makeup, and also you lose the opportunities for mentoring between older kids and younger kids. Like there's so many benefits from but this was all done in the name of equity. Not to mention the busing that you'd have to do, the congestion, all these issues. But this was one of the recommendations in the name of equity, and all of this just didn't seem to make sense. And but no one was really saying anything, or no one was saying anything publicly. Like I was having a little chatter. I'm like, well, why not share your concerns? Like, we can't, because if we say anything publicly, then even an honest disagreement or an honest questioning will be construed as being against equity, and we've said it multiple times, you'll be called all sorts of terrible things. So I said, well, all right, well, I'll just write a document, and I wrote this 9-page critique of the equity audit, and I think it's posted online. I think it's a very helpful document for people who are in districts where an equity audit has been done, and you want to see an example of, in my view, an objective review of such a document. And I just tried to make the case of why I thought there were issues with the research, in a reasoned fashion, not hyperbolic. Because if we want what's best for kids, then let's at least be honest about the data. Let's figure out where there are issues, if there are disparities. Is it because of racial discrimination, or there are other factors that might be at play? And in my own district, for every black kid that wasn't reading, there were 4 times as many white kids that were not reading at grade level, partly because there are more white kids overall, but that's a racial disparity. Is that structural racism there? So if there are underlying issues for why kids aren't reading, maybe there are reasons that go beyond the singular factor of race. So I try to just make these cases, make this case in as reasoned a way as possible. But again, all of this, I hadn't really thought about running for school board. So I wrote this document. I then, presented it to the superintendent because, again, no one's trying to demonize or embarrass. So I met with the superintendent and had a really good meeting about here are the things. When you look at this data, do you see that it's the representation of superintendent suspension rates is inaccurate? She's like, oh, that's interesting. And so it was helpful, but it's almost like a speeding train that had already started down the sort of the DEI road. And at that point I said, you know what, let me run for school board. Because one of the other things I looked at, just looking at our school board, I looked, and this is the kind of the laborious work nerdy people like me do, and my wife, but we looked at the last 3 years of votes, and there literally was not a single vote that was not unanimous in 3 years. So just think about that for a second. I mean, if you're on the board of any organization, nonprofit or for-profit, like boards are supposed to deliberate, discuss, debate. Almost nothing is, 10 to 0, 8 to 0 all the time, right? And so, because either two things are happening. One is you're just all so, there's no viewpoint diversity. You're so ideologically aligned. You're just all just in lockstep all the time, right? That's one possibility. Or you are actually having discussions in executive session or in other ways, and in order to present a united front, you always just come to conclusions and then the board meeting itself is just kind of perfunctory, right? But that's not good either because you're depriving your constituency of seeing the debate and you're probably violating open meetings law as well. So that just suggested to me that we should just have viewpoint diversity on these things. And if ideas like the Princeton Plan were one thing that was going to come out of the equity audit, like we should have public debate about that. So I decided to run for school board, and I decided to create a website where I put my thoughts down on paper. I published my critique of the equity audit. I put it on the Facebook page of our town, and that engendered a lot of discussion. But I think people really just appreciated that someone took the time to really outline the issue, pros and cons, and come to some conclusions, because it was an example of, I think, the reasoned debate that we need in our society across a number of issues. And so I just decided to write a series of position papers on each of the major issues in our town. One was on the Princeton Plan, one was on special education, and I just started to get a sense of what were the issues that parents were really concerned about. And what you start to realize, most parents aren't spending all day thinking about critical race theory. They want their student with special needs to make sure that they're getting the services that are in their individualized education plan. They want to make sure that their honors classes, if that's something that you want to pursue, or that foreign language is done well, and that bullying is not happening. And so I realized, this is why we all do the work that we do. We're not. I don't think most people in this room are ideologues who are trying to quote unquote indoctrinate kids. But if we see something like that is happening in ways that are disturbing, I think it's our duty to fight back. And throughout my campaign, the phrase that I said probably 500 or 600 times was equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity. I said that over and over and over and over again because I wanted people to know what were my underlying principles, beliefs, because that would inform anything that I would do. Because you can't, if you're running for office, you can't say exactly how you're going to vote on every issue, but I want you to know the principles upon which that I would use to make decisions. And I also thought it was important to publish the position papers, and then I had weekly, meet and greets. I had them in person, online. So if you're thinking of running for office, that's a very important, I think, strategy. Because I wanted to model in my campaign what I would do if I were to be elected, which is being very open and transparent around the way that I think about things, because we're all human. We're fallible, but it's just really important to show like what's the basis upon which you make your decisions. And I think most people who are sending their kids to school want school board members that seem fair and just and willing to listen to lots of different opinion. And so again, if you're considering running for school board, I think that's something extremely important. The process is very simple. I had to get 25 names to sign on, and I was off to the races. But check with your spouse to make sure that this is something you want to do, because it's a big time commitment. You know, in my town, it's you meet every 2 weeks. There's subcommittees. There are people calling from all over the place saying, you know, what are you doing about X, Y, Z issues? So it's a big time commitment. But I think honestly, of all the jobs I have, like I'm a traditional Jamaican that like 7 jobs, but this job is, you know, by far the most important. And the issue I think, like if you cut across critical race theory, critical gender theory, all these things that we're talking about, the thing that seemed to trouble parents the most was just lack of transparency. You know, that they didn't know what was going on with their own kids in schools. And that can range from a number of things. I think Charles just talked about. It could be, you know, your kid being called, you know, certain pronouns or different names at school, but you have no idea what's happening at home. I mean, I had a teacher come to me and say, can you imagine what that means for us at a parent-teacher conference? That I'm being instructed to call a kid one thing, but then sitting with a parent of that kid and not communicating that, right? And again, it could range from you know, race-related things that are just developmentally inappropriate in school, but just fundamentally parents don't know. And that, more than anything, I think is what is animating so many parents, because they're starting to discover what is actually happening in classrooms. And I think COVID really shed light, because now you had literally millions of kids home all day and their parents were like already frustrated, and then hearing, wait, my kid's 6 years old, and they're dealing with things that seem not like what we learned at 6 years old. And I think that's a healthy thing, that parents should want to be engaged in their schools. And there was just a Democratic candidate for governor at a debate a couple of days ago who basically said parents should have no say in what kids are learning. And he's probably going to pay a consequence for saying that, because I'm... Well, there you have it. Just there. Well, there you have it. Parents have a right. So again, there are 2 roles that you can play in this fight: run for school board, or support someone outstanding who is running for school board. Because at the end of the day, in your hometown, it almost doesn't matter what Secretary Cardona says. You know, that's probably somewhat blasphemous to say, but in your hometown, it's all about the school board. You know, what's the curriculum? What are the policies? What are the bathroom signs, which we're discussing right now, because the bathroom signs are at an issue right now. It's like it's extremely local. You know, we're having discussions about a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And in this draft document, it's tons of jargon. No one can understand it. And so now that I'm a member of the school board, I won. So that was important. I won in May, and so I started my term on July 1st. And it's really important just not to demonize and presume and make all sorts of assumptions, and just start with the premise that we all want what's best for our kids. That's, for me, because I can be wrong. You know, sometimes I think it's so hard for people to say that these days, because everyone's so certain that they're right or correct. And so we have this draft diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, and it's got all these words of responsiveness and cultural this and cultural that, but you have no idea what it actually means. So I just start asking basic questions like, if you create policy, it's to enumerate new powers or it's to restrict existing powers, right? Otherwise, why do you need a policy? And sometimes and just asking basic questions like, what are the powers that this policy is now, because it says, one of the lines, this probably 30 words, it says curriculum, like, well, don't you already have the ability to do curriculums? Like, what is this string of 30 words that no one can understand? What does it actually mean? And no one can answer the question. And so now we're going back to simplify and clarify. And again, fundamentally, if we can't answer basic questions like that, then something's wrong with the policy. Or there's some other agenda going on, so let's just expose that and be transparent about it. And so far, it was a very rough campaign. It was very hostile, very personal, very negative. All sorts of terrible things were said about me, my family. So the stakes are really high. And you have to be prepared to deal with that. Unfortunately, we live in a time where our school board is apolitical, or it's supposed to be. And again, I very much tried to be, there's no Republican or Democrat or independent way to teach reading, right? Can we have an academic dashboard? That seems like a good idea. Like maybe the absence of the things where we track the things that are supposed to be important to us, maybe the absence of those things is what creates the void where we fill it with all this other stuff that doesn't seem to be connected to good outcomes for kids. So if I were to just encourage you to think about school board, because I do think all of the great work everyone is doing in this room is absolutely essential, from policymakers, but that's where the action is. That's where decisions are being made about your own kids in your own hometown. And if you see things that are bothering you, speak up. I'm going to speak to Ashley a little bit later, I guess right after this, about courage, because it will take some courage. There will be people who take honest dissent as an assault on their position and will try to bully you into submission and silence. And that's really unfortunate. We are at that place. But my response to that was equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity. Because that's what we want for our kids. That's the way we want all of our kids. That's the environment in which we want our kids to grow in. We don't want our kids to be scared. We don't want our kids to feel bullied if they have a different idea. And we also want to be empathetic to kids with gender identity issues. Like, this isn't, we just want what's best for kids, and we want to be adults that have rational conversations about how to make good decisions for kids. And again, I think school board is the place to do that, because instead of Twitter, the social media where people are anonymous, you're sitting with your neighbors who you have to live with. And come to conclusions and the right answer. And you won't always agree. And you should show that. Sometimes a 5-2 vote, a 4-3 vote is important for the community to see. It shows that, okay, my side was represented, but there was a deliberate process, a decision was made, and now we can move forward, right? It's a 3-year term. Of meeting every 2 weeks. It's a huge commitment. It'll probably be the most worthy work you ever do in your life, not only for your own children, but for all the children in your district. You likely will be called bad names, which is quite amazing. I don't think it ever was like that before, running for school board in particular. But what that just means is that the stakes are high, and the things that you're fighting for are really, 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 really important to your kids. All kids, kids of all races. I said during the campaign, my son is not oppressed, my daughter is not marginalized, because there was this thing, it's like all the colored kids, they're marginalized and oppressed. I'm like, we live in a pretty privileged town, and so this sort of race reductionism is not helpful. But there's a way to have that conversation in such a way that the people who are saying it, when they're actually dealing with a human being in front of them, it just changes things. And I think maybe it'll take longer, but the way that we fight the macro issues is probably going to have to be micro for a little bit. And I'm down for that fight. And ultimately, I speak a lot about these issues nationally, and I'm running schools and all that. But at the end of the day, I could not be speaking nationally about issues around race and equity and equality of opportunity if I wasn't willing to confront this in my own hometown. And in some ways, I'd forgo all the other work to do what I'm doing as school board member. So with that, I'd love to take questions if there are any. Questions? Up this? Oh, there are a whole bunch.
Have you been able to sway any votes on your school board?
Yes.
So there's more than just one?
So here's a couple things. So when I was running, there was a lot of pressure to nationalize my school board race. Because here's a black guy who's a little bit more centered, who's not on the equity bandwagon, but really for equality. And so there were a number of people who wanted to make our race like the like Southlake in Texas, where Hannah Smith is from. And I resisted that effort significantly because having that kind of national spotlight is at cross purposes with having reasoned discourse on a local basis. People get defensive, they back up. And so that was true during the campaign, and it's really true now. Because we have to govern, we have to serve locally. I'm not looking to embarrass or demonize any of my fellow board members or highlight certain votes, we've been victorious or not. But the answer is yes. I mean, the answer is I think there's more viewpoint diversity in our discussions. These are all good people. Everyone wants the best for kids. We just have different ideas on how to get there. And I think if we continue to have that as our mindset and our approach, we will make more progress. So I'll refrain from saying the specifics because that's not what's most important. What's most important is that we now have an environment in which I think we've got just differing views on how to reach similar objectives.
One more question. In my particular school district in Kingston, New York, it seems like our superintendent is basically dictatorial and no one wishes to go against his beliefs or his agenda. Do you see that more nationwide?
Right, so again, there are two roles that you have to play. Run for school board or support outstanding candidates for the school board. And the reason for that is that the school boards hire the superintendent. Mm-hmm. The superintendent does not, they're not a dictator, right? Or that's what they shouldn't be. The school board has oversight responsibility over the district superintendent for ensuring that goals are clear, that they're achieved, that there's a review process, that there's accountability. So if that's the case, then I would strongly suggest you run for school board. If you think the superintendent is just completely doing whatever he or she wants to do, the school board votes are always unanimous, and it just appears that they're always in lockstep, that's probably not good for kids, in my view. But no one can control the superintendent other than the school board. I mean, perhaps you can have loud parent gatherings at school boards, but that's what I think that's not, I mean, on one level it's great when you see parent revolt, and to some degree you have to fight if no other channels are there for you, so you got to do that. But my hope is that the school board, which is an elected body, is holding the superintendent accountable in such a way that you don't believe that they're a dictator and that they will answer to their constituents.
Well, to your questions, let's try to use the scan on the table, and if you were watching the live stream, makes it easier. So, it's 2021. We don't want to have to run all over with a microphone, unless you just don't like to hear my voice asking you a question. But to the school board thing, it's really important. My organization, Seeking Educational Excellence, because there's so many organizations, and Bill did a great job earlier saying, this is what we do. We let the other groups focus on what they do, so they're not overstepping. And one of our things is all about trying to help people run for the school board. So if you want to run for your school board, we try to help find funding, reach to the parents and do that, because that's where you're going to do it. You're going to do it at the local level. And so feel free to ask a couple more questions if you want. But one here, William H. Livestream again, is wondering basically if the people who are opposing whatever we want to call this stuff, you have two different viewpoints, and you want to debate that. Why are they so angry, and why do you think they initially go to, you're a racist, because you want, like you said, just, viewpoint diversity. Why does that make you a racist?
I mean, who wants to be called a racist?
Right.
It's a very effective strategy.
It does work.
Right? I mean, no one wants, and how can you be anti-racist? Mm-hmm. And so part of the way you deal with that is through, personal relationships where you can say, quite honestly, I'm against racism, but I'm not anti-racist the way it's predominantly defined. And you say what that means in your own life. This is what I stand for kids: equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity.
Right.
That's my approach to being pro-human, to being against racism. And you just have to spend the time and trust that the people that you're speaking to will actually start to see the wisdom in what you're talking about, or hopefully the faults in what they're demanding of you. We can fight bigotry without spreading bigotry. And I probably said that a couple 100 times.
And it must have worked. Elena, only because you have the microphone.
I do, thank you. What you did apparently in your own fight to get that school board seat was a beautiful model, I think, that should be really replicated. However, I want to go back to a comment that Bill said, and we know that's the reality on the ground. So many organizations, very well funded, who have agenda. So the school board elections around the country are not free from people who are very committed to a certain agenda that are very well funded. So your election, was handled in a very beautiful way, I think, from the way you described it. But the reality on the ground is we are fighting with a well-funded organization with political agendas. The school board do have political agenda. Right. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, so in terms of technical specifications, there are funding restrictions. Any candidate has to show sources of money that's coming in. So there are public election funding disclosures that are necessary. But you're right. I mean, I was not, I was not funded by anyone. I just hope, honestly, that the power of my ideas would win the day. You cannot get around the level of divisiveness and quote unquote outside money. But again, in a local election, you got to knock on doors. And by the way, you also have had to have been involved in your community before. I guess that's another important thing. Mm-hmm. Don't just show up like, oh, now I'm concerned about schools because I think someone's showing, doing critical race theory in schools. Then that erodes your credibility. I've been involved in my community. I'm known for reasons that had nothing to do with school board, right? So that goes a long way, because at the end of the day, most parents don't care about an ad or who's funding what. Are you going to ensure that my students with special needs are getting what they need, that we have a high college graduation rate, that there are multiple foreign languages in our school, that the things that most parents care about? That might be a little bit of a dodge, I don't know, but I think it's overcomable. I do think if there's large money, I mean, Hannah, who's not here, I mean, they had a lot of money in that campaign, and I mean, she should talk more because she had a situation where I think both sides were incredibly well funded, but I wonder if she would say at the end of the day that the thing that won the day was her message as opposed to the amount of money that was put into the campaign. I'd like to believe it was the message. But you do have to be prepared for your opponents to say bad things about you.
Right.
And you just have to sort of turn that around by reciting things like equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and common humanity.
Well, let me ask you a question on that, though, because we hear a lot about cancel culture and people are afraid to speak out. But one thing that's important, which is why we push people to run, because a lot of people won't say anything, right? They won't tweet anything, they won't say anything verbally, but when they vote, they get to vote without saying what they believe. So there's a lot of parents, we have to understand that there are a lot of parents that think this stuff is bad, but it's like, man, you know, they DM you on Twitter and say, I can't say this personally, but this is bad. So when they get to go vote, they listen to what your ideas are, and they say, that makes sense, I'm gonna vote for that guy. So it doesn't matter how much money you put into it, pushing this stuff, if the parents honestly don't believe it. They may be afraid to say something, but you can still get that vote.
I think that's actually a good point, because I won a significant amount of votes. That was not, if you were to have just spent time on social media, you would think, you know, I was the Antichrist, right? And, but it didn't turn out that way at all. In fact, far the opposite.
And then you have another incumbent that lost when you ran as well?
So yeah, so in our race, there were 7 seats in total. There were 2 incumbents. There were 5 people running, including the 2 incumbents. And so I won. And the other person that won, I think, is much more ideologically aligned. But, you know, again, not in lockstep. We don't agree on everything, but just more ideologically aligned with this idea that let's put kids first. Let's not create a wedge between parents and kids. And let's have viewpoint diversity. And we won. And I'd say by a wide margin. And so, again, I just think that just speaks to this point that there can be a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, the vote is still private.
Right, exactly. So we got a question over here, but first I want to go to Chris here, who has an interesting question about local, state, national. He's wondering what the unions are trying to do and what part does that play in the candidates who are running?
Again, without getting into detail, let's just say in my race, the head of the local union sent a physical letter to hundreds of people in my town saying how, how terrible I am, how, even though I've run schools in the heart of the South Bronx for 10 years, how I'm not an educator and all this kind of stuff. But I think it had a negative impact. And to the degree of it on the efforts of my opponents that I think he was trying to support, because people just didn't like that, And nothing that I was doing in my campaign justified that kind of behavior against me, right? So this idea of, Bill talked about, preserving the moral high ground, it's actually a really important thing, and choose your battles. There's all sorts of vitriol on social media. There's no value in the back and forth, zero, none. I used it as a platform to push information out when I had policy papers because I wanted everyone to know what I was thinking. But in terms of, no, that's unproductive.
Last question.
Thank you. I wanted to drill down on the governance piece, hopefully not get too esoteric, but I joined a school board myself last year. And I also did not get the union endorsement.
Of course not.
But one of the things that I've realized in my town is that we are not district. So the counselors are all at large, school board members are all at large, as opposed to having districts like you would in a larger town or a larger city. And so I realized that there's a third of our town that actually has no one on either the council or the school board. And in fact, our town council, there is a majority of the members live in one small neighborhood. And so one of my goals is actually to make a structural change, hopefully by the end of my term, where we can get more structural, more structure that guarantees a wider viewpoint diversity, because people live in different places for a reason. But I was hoping that you could speak to some of that governance about how the school board itself is structured, its relationship to the state departments of education, and there are things that are going on to sort of change the change what school boards can do. Maybe pull more authority up towards the state level, pull authority away from the states towards the national level. So can you speak a little bit more about that governance piece, about how those different entities interact?
Yeah, I mean, in our instance, for the most part, our school board's in control. I mean, there are definitely, especially during COVID, there have been some efforts to sort of make statewide decisions about protocols that we may want to implement, especially for COVID. But generally, we have total control over things like curriculum, hiring. Like in New York, there were guidelines issued, for example, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they weren't mandates. And so there are a set of recommended statements, some of which was all sorts of jargon, and you could see how that manifested itself in the policy that we're now debating, but we're not bound by it. And in fact, we don't even have to have a policy. But I think if we can construct it in a way that actually is grounded in the ideas of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, common humanity, then that could be something very productive. So I haven't felt the kind of encroachment that I think you're talking about. In terms of representation, our school board is for the entire town. And it's non-political. The 3-year terms. Next year there are 3 slots opening up, which will be a battle royale, I think. But hopefully, I think it'll be informed by how we handled our campaign this year, or at least the more positive elements of the campaign. Let's speak privately, because it sounds like you might have specifics that maybe I could know more about, but we haven't felt that level of encroachment. And again, I feel like we have a lot of power to make decisions regarding what we think is best for kids without intrusion at the federal or state level.
So we're going to move on now, but you'll be able to ask other questions, because Ian's staying, actually, you're just going to bring
right,
up...
now I'm going to speak about
talk
my life.
about leadership, right?
Right, yes, okay. Onward with Ashley Jacobs. Yay.
Thank you for pinch hitting for Hannah. That was great. I thought it would be really interesting to talk about 4 things with you that you've been working hard to accomplish: leadership, courage, agency, and equity. And your personal story is really interesting, and I was hoping you could start with that, because you're a person who could be doing anything with their life. You've had some incredible jobs, everything from MTV to the Gates Foundation, and yet here you are.
That thing at Chippendales.
Oh.
Oh, okay, I can wait.
Sorry.
So tell us about your journey and why you're here doing this work.
Okay, my journey. Well, I think like most of us, our journey starts very personally with our parents and the decisions that they actually made that influenced how we rise. And my parents are from Jamaica, West Indies. They came to the United States in the mid-1960s when there was true racial strife in our country. So they were coming eyes wide open with what they would face in the United States. And, but they knew that the country was changing as well. You know, there was the Civil Rights Act, there were more and more opportunities opening. My dad became one of the first black engineers at IBM. My mom started working on Wall Street. So they were very focused on the American dream for their 2 kids. And And so, but the thing my parents always instilled with this was that there will be opportunity, but there will be challenges in this country. You will face racial discrimination. The question is, are you going to be prepared when those opportunities come? And so, with the support of a strong family, strong faith commitment, and strong public education, that was kind of their formula for how to be successful in the United States, knowing what they knew about racial discrimination in particular. So I'm a New York City public school kid, K through 12. I went to Brooklyn Tech High School, which some of you know. I think Daniel is in here somewhere, a Brooklyn Tech alum, go Engineers. That's one of the specialized high schools in New York that you've got to take a test to get into. Again, in the name of equity, there's some people who think because they don't like the racial makeup in the school, let's just eliminate the test, right? Like that'll solve the problem of what's happening before high school, that there aren't enough kids prepared, but we can talk about that. But I think one of the seminal experiences I had growing up was when we first came to the country, we moved to Brooklyn on Wyona Street in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn. And then after a few years, my parents moved on up to Queens, if you ever see the Jeffersons television show. And so we moved to this small town, Laurelton, Queens, which at the time was predominantly white, but it was definitely becoming more racially integrated. And unfortunately, that meant a lot more racial conflict. And there were incidents in the junior high school that I was now attending, Junior High School 231. To the point where the school board, just back to school boards, made a decision that the way to solve this problem of racial conflict was not to do DEI training, but they solved it by saying, let's create another physical school, an annex, another junior high school in Rosedale, Queens, which was a more permanently white part of town. And so basically what happened was all of the white parents in Junior High School 231 decided to take their kids out of our school and put them in to Rosedale, making Junior High School 231 essentially a segregated all-black school. And my parents from Jamaica, who wanted their kids to pursue the American dream on the presumption that if that's where the white kids are going, the education's going to be better in this other school, in this annex. And I share this story often, but it was the Sunday night before the Monday morning where they had to put the transfer papers in, and my dad was in his recliner, like their normal positions in our living room. My mom was on the couch, and I'm like 12 years old, and I'm begging my parents not to transfer me. Basically, why does the education have to be better over there, and why does it have to be worse here just because all the kids that are going to be left are black? I love my teachers. I love my school. Why would we leave? I'll work harder. I commit. I promise. And my parents, as you can tell, probably had a huge role in my life. My parents were married for 48 years before my dad passed away. So they would do anything for me. So if they were saying that your education is going to be better at this school, I'm 12 years old. I have no reason. I've never questioned my parents on anything. But in this situation, for the first time, I really begged and pleaded that I would stay, or I wanted to stay in our school, and they relented. And I stayed at Junior High School 231, and then went to Brooklyn Tech and Cornell and Harvard Business School and all this other stuff. But that experience was really important to me because it was the first time. I didn't know what I would call it then, but I think I would call it now a sense of agency, that I had a level of influence over my outcomes, and that I had a responsibility because I had to now make my parents feel good that they had made this decision to let me stay. So I think that experience has informed my career. It's why I run charter schools. I run schools where 98, 99% of the kids are of color, 80, 85% are low income. I'm not waiting for wealthy white kids to suddenly start showing up in the South Bronx to go to schools, right? Like, you know, let's just run exceptional schools regardless of the demographic makeup. So that's been something I think that's always been part of who I am.
So going back to the schools, what are the habits for success that are making these kids flourish in your schools?
Well, first of all, we can always be better. You know, any school leader will tell you, you know, you see all the things that you're not doing right. But the things I think that work for kids, you start with high expectations, regardless. I think one of the challenges, particularly and this is urban, rural schools where kids are coming from tough backgrounds, as opposed to raising your expectations, you lower them. Like, oh, you know, these kids, you know, look, they're in a single parent household, they're poor, you know, they're homeless, you know, whatever the real issue is, it can lead to a suffocating empathy in the sense that you express so much concern and compassion that you actually reduce your expectation of what you think this kid can accomplish. So I think it has to start there. It has to start with very, very high expectations of future orientation. You know, your ability to see your future, what you have the ability to accomplish, having exemplars of, you know, I have a podcast now with my colleague Nike Fajor, called The Invisible Men, that, you know, every week or so we highlight an amazing, you know, usually black man who's people from all sorts of backgrounds who are doing amazing things that in our view are invisible in the larger society, because the dominant narrative is that if you're a black man in this country, you know, you're an endangered species. You're going to get shot while walking your dog. And so I think it's just important for kids to see those kinds of exemplars, high expectations, rigorous curriculum, which is why things like the practices associated with critical race theory can be so corrosive and damaging. Like, imagine if you're 7 years old and you keep hearing over and over and over and over again about white power, or like you're oppressed simply because of your skin color, that the entire society is rigged against you. You're 7 years old. Give me a shot. And so it's really important. Like, that's why I fight against this stuff. You know, not because I'm some ideologue. I just see what happens when kids internalize a message that is dangerous. And kids on all sides. I mean, there's a lawsuit right now where a group of kids were in this thing called a privilege walk, where kids are told, you know, take 2 steps forward if you're white, take 2 steps backward if you're black. Like, imagine if I divided this entire room right now, we did that exercise, and at the end of it, all the black people are in the back and all the white people are in the front, to somehow evidence your privilege. And literally, the lesson plan in this particular case for this privilege walk said it's intended so that white kids understand their, quote, internalized dominance, end quote. It's like we're trying to develop little white supremacists, you know? So that's why this work is so important to fight, not because it's an ideological, but because it hurts kids.
So you talk about the opportunity cost, and in Massachusetts, they just released the Mcas Scores for this year, which is our standardized testing that people say is controversial, right? Because it penalizes kids for equity reasons. But it turns out that kids aren't reading, and they're not doing math, but they're getting a lot of this other stuff. There's data, right? I mean, we all know that the K through 8, K through 12, the standards are not where they should be. Kids don't have the skills that they need to progress. How can you possibly make the case for more DEI and less math and less reading? Like, how are we missing this opportunity?
Well, people are making the case because they're confident they can bully rational people into ignoring obvious information. I mean, if you look at what's called the Nation's Report Card, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, it's given every 2 years, and reading and math, it's been given since the early 90s. In the entire history of NAEP, National Assessment for Educational Progress, there has never been a situation in which a majority of white students are reading at grade level. right? At 4th, 8th, nor 12th grade. So, I mean, we tend to have this conversation centered around victimized Black kids, but we have a reading crisis in our country across race, and perhaps the factors that are driving white kids not to read in such high levels is probably related to the reasons that Black kids are not, and those have things to do with, like, stable family structures in which kids are being raised, or the ability to do what my wife and I did. We were able to move to a neighborhood which had great schools, which I'm now trying to make better. School choice, rigorous curriculum, like all these things are factors that get ignored when you have critical race theory and that kind of ideology suck all the energy out of the room. And so when folks are fighting for racial equity, racial equity, if white kids are the standard, that means racial equity essentially means universal mediocrity, because no singular group is doing well, or certainly not across the board. And so how do we stop this race reductionism, right? And how do we really analyze the things that make all schools work? High expectations, rigorous curriculum, family engagement, transparency. Those are the things that work. And again, that's, for me, and I've written about this now, a lot of this discussion around critical race theory is just a massive distraction. In San Diego, quick story, San Diego, they did some analysis and they found that, I guess in 2019, 80% or 20% of the Black kids got either a D or an F. They were 20%, but only 7% of white kids got a D or an F, right? And so they said, because of this disparity, this 13% difference between Black and white kids, that must be due to systemic racism. And instead of analyzing, well, what's going on well with 80% of Black kids that are passing, or 93% of white kids that are passing, is it that they're studying more, tutoring? No. We have to become an anti-racist school district. And the first action they took was on the assumption that Black kids can't get their homework in on time. They said, we're going to remove the requirement that all kids, all 120,000 kids in San Diego now do not have to hand their homework in on time. It's just like one of these idiotic, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think about, gosh, if I were on school board, I would just say to my colleague, does that make sense to you? Don't you think homework, getting into the cadence and the responsibility, even if you're looking at mastery at the end of the year, does that make sense to you? And I think, again, back to school boards, being able to say obvious things or ask simple questions, it's just that right now there's kind of this speeding train ideology that folks just think they just have to go along to get along. When it doesn't make sense, say something.
So you're on the school board, but you're also running and starting new schools.
Yes, very important.
What's the perfect new school? There's people here that are interested in starting new schools.
Wow.
What do we do?
Well, I think you should start schools that are committed to this idea of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and common humanity. Seriously. So that's the basis upon which we're launching our new network of high schools, Vertex Partnership Academies. It'll be an international baccalaureate model.
Why did you choose that model?
Because it's a world-class curriculum that people presume is not accessible to low-income kids. And I'm like, that's an inaccurate presumption. And so we have to build institutions that exemplify what it is that we're all talking about in theory, right? If we want to have democratic discourse in our society, then we have to build educational institutions that promote democratic discourse. I think we're going to hear from Beth Feely later about how her high school adopted the Chicago Statement. Like those are powerful things. I just think people need to see what's possible in practice. And for me, I don't ever want to just be the guy that's doing these kinds of sessions and chatting and writing essays, which is important. But I want to practice what I am preaching. I want to show what's possible by doing the work in communities. So you can't just dismiss me. Like, you know, when I show up at 149th Street and 3rd Avenue, like, that's real stuff. And these are folks, you know, we had 5,000 families on our wait list. You know, that's the most excruciating thing, to tell a 23-year-old mom who, whatever decisions she has made in her own life, she wants the best for her child. And she's in a district where only 2% are graduating from high school ready for college. Like, that's an enormous responsibility that we are taking on. And so I encourage folks to run for school board, support people who are outstanding to be school board members, or consider starting schools or supporting outstanding people who are starting schools. Parental choice in education is a big part of this strategy. And you know, the data showed, the U.S. Census data just did an analysis where the rate of homeschooling within the Black community was like 3.3%. It's risen to 16.6%. That's a massive increase, and it's a yearning for alternative options in education.
So how do you find teachers? Because it seems like that's part of the problem, right? The teaching schools have been corrupted, as Bill was discussing earlier. That's the bottleneck for a lot of this, right?
It's a real challenge, and I think part of the way that you do that is that you signal significantly to prospective families, teachers, what you're all about. So if on your homepage you say things that you're dedicated to, like equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and common humanity, then that sends a signal to prospective folks that it's probably unlikely that DEI in its general form or in its norm form is going to be something that you hear. Or if you go on our site and you read our statement that, you know, hopefully we'll have up soon about democratic discourse, that we're pro-human, that then I think, you know, teachers like Paul Rossi, who, you know, showed incredible courage to go against his school system, says, you know, this doesn't seem right for kids. I think there are a lot of teachers like Paul Rossi in the world who are yearning for environments where they're not being pressured to say these things. Because do you want to be a teacher who's telling a white kid, go step forward because of your internalized dominance? Who entered teaching to do that, right? And I think the more that, because a lot of this does come back to leadership. Leadership, leadership, leadership. Leadership, leaders create the environment that people know that they can agree, disagree, that we can deal with complex topics. We're not going to demonize each other. We're not going to reduce you to just your race. And I think teachers, some of the best teachers in the country want to operate in those kind of environments, especially with vulnerable populations of kids.
How can you scale this?
You know, scaling is a tough challenge in general in public education because school is local. You know, we have a model that we think we do want to replicate it, but even at capacity, I mean, there are charter schools. I mean, KIPP is, you know, 200 plus schools across the country, so there are ways to do it. But even that, even 200 plus schools is a tiny drop. So, you know, for me, you know, Vertex Partnership Academies, you know, my hope is that we, you know, launch a new high school campus every 2 years. You know, we build new buildings, we serve 900 to 1,000 students per campus, almost exclusively in low-income communities. You know, that we build 5 or 6 in the next decade. You know, I ran public prep, you know, my prior network for 10 years. You know, so I like the idea of decadal commitments where you, you know, you have leadership for a period of time and then you pass the baton on to a next leader. And then what you're doing, the scalability, is the model that you've created. You know, does the legislative structure that allows this to happen, you know, can that now be replicated in other places? I mean, New York City right now, there's a cap on the number of charters, right? So if you wanted to open a school in this district where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, you couldn't do it, right? And so that's got to be a part of our work as well. So part of the scalability question is ensuring that the legislative environment allows this kind of innovation to occur.
You talk about leadership, and we've talked about corporate leadership as sort of mimicking all of this stuff that's going on and making it harder for the average person to stand up because they're getting it at school, they're getting it at work.
Yep.
How do you see the interplay between corporate America and education? And where's the opportunity to sort of reset in a way that, to your point, espouses similar principles of humanity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've had the fortune over the last 6 months to a year to speak to a number of CEOs of very large companies who feel under enormous pressure to do something, right? Their millennial staff or, when are you changing the corporate Instagram page to have a black box to demonstrate our, allegiance to the cause? Or when are we making a commitment to Black Lives Matter? And in the absence of a compelling alternative, that's what a lot of these companies are doing. I think that won't sustain, especially, like, for example, Netflix, I think, just did something interesting where they took, I think, 2% of their cash holdings, which turns out to be about $100 million, and they're transferring that money into primarily Black-owned and financial institutions that are more local in urban and rural communities across the country. So that money now can be invested locally in folks who want to start their dry cleaning company, or just local businesses who want to get loans or venture capital. And to me, that's an example of something that's generative, right? That has reciprocity, that has expectations, because no one's just going to give away money. No bank is just going to give away money unless there's an idea. Like, you've got to create a business plan or some worthwhile. So I think those kind of ideas that have reciprocity, that are generative, those are the ones we have to start to uplift to give models. And I think more and more CEOs, and I'm certainly in my own work going to be trying to do this, is to have companies think about, what's your corporate mission? Like, what's your core competence? And who's the audience that you actually want to serve? And then figure out ideas that play to your strengths, that actually have expectations of the people that you're seeking to celebrate and uplift. I mean, the Coca-Cola company, if you remember, maybe 6 months ago, their corporate counsel, who's Black, or was Black, or he's still Black, but he's no longer corporate counsel. He basically set a rule that said, if any law firm wanted to do business with Coca-Cola, they had to have a 30% quota on their lawyers, and that essentially meant 30% Black. And it's just one of these ideas that people pat themselves on the back, but all that really does is you're reshuffling the Black professional elite who are doing quite well and who now have even better offers from law firms, but you're doing nothing to actually address the pipeline issue of what's happening in the K-12 systems that should be allowing kids of all races to be pursuing law or other professions. So the good news is that they ended that, and I think Coca-Cola is now considering doing something which is more developmental, which I think those are the kinds of things I think we have to celebrate. Like, don't do this, but what's the compelling alternative that's more empowering for kids?
Speaking of alternatives, 1776 Unites has a lot of curriculum. Tell us about that and how you get that out there, because we didn't even really know about it until probably a month or two ago, and we've been in this space.
Yeah. So, if folks know, if you should learn about anyone, you should learn about this gentleman whose name is Bob Woodson, who's just an incredible human being for the last 40, 50 years, has been working in communities to create agents of their own uplift. Like, how do you work with community leaders who are closest to the problems, who are closest to the solutions, and get them the resources they need? And he's just been doing that and building these incredible coalitions. And so when the New York Times launched their 1619 project, the New York Times, obviously a very powerful institution in our country, had an idea that they wanted to reframe the very founding of the country. The country's founding was not 1776, it was 1619. The country was founded as a slaveocracy, not a democracy. The founding principles were, quote, false when they were written. I mean, these were pretty bold assertions, and it was inside a magazine issue. But then they decided that it wasn't enough just to influence adults through the magazine. They wanted to get these ideas in front of kids. And the New York Times 1619 Project created a curriculum. They partnered with the Pulitzer Center. And they created this curriculum, and we heard almost right away they distributed in 3,500 schools, teachers, hard to measure. And Bob Woodson said, rather than just shout in the rain and complain and blah, 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 which is useful, but it doesn't go far enough. One of the big things I think for me is you can't just criticize. You've got to present an empowering and compelling alternative. Like, what is it that you're standing for that's better than what the other person is saying, right? So Bob said, let's create a curriculum that doesn't cherry pick only the most negative aspects of American history and weave together this narrative of a permanently racist country. Simultaneously, let's not sanitize American history. So you cleanse and just make it seem like, oh, America's so great. Like, just tell the truth. Just tell the whole story, warts and all. So if you're creating a curriculum unit about the Tulsa Massacre, you don't only tell the story of the Tulsa Massacre, which was an important event in American history, but also talk about the entrepreneurship and the business ownership that in the Black community that led to all the generation of Black wealth leading up to the massacre, then the terrible event of the massacre, and then the rebuilding that occurred afterwards. That's a more complete story. So we determined to create a 1776 Unites curriculum. It ultimately will be K-12. We launched it September of 2020. And I don't know where Beth is, but I think we're now we've downloaded more than 21,000. Yeah, Will, you said 17,000. Since you got that number, I think we're now more than 21,000 downloads. That's applause. These are teachers in all 50 states and private schools, charter schools, traditional district schools, home schools, after schools, prison ministries. It's being used with women who are re-entering after being in prison for a number of, just amazing how it's being deployed. And in it are stories of like the Tulsa Massacre, the Rosenwald schools, which is an amazing story about how Booker T. Washington partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who was the CEO of the Sears company at the time, the biggest retailer, to build more than or nearly 5,000 schools throughout the South exclusively for Black kids during Jim Crow. It's like one of the great stories of empowerment and resiliency in American history, and yet not a single mention of the Rosenwald schools is in the 1619 Project. Like, how is that possible? And so we are rolling out this curricula, and again, right now it's just for the upper grades. Tuesday night we launched a new component of the 1776 Unites curriculum, which is actually going to start focusing on contemporary scholars, because believe it or not, there are people outside of Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones that speak for the Black community. And in fact, we don't even take this position, we speak for the Black community, but there is this perception that those are the people, and yet there are folks like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Wilfred Riley, well, whatever. And so we're now going to have units on each one of these individuals. And I just think diversity of thought, the name of this conference, is what it's all about. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish. And yeah.
So we're going to break for lunch shortly, but we do have time for a couple questions, and I think I want to ask the first one. So you're talking about leadership and courage, and earlier you mentioned something about, I don't know why I didn't reach out to you, probably because you're so busy, but you talked about talking to some of the CEOs. And one of the things I want to work on is giving other alternatives. You talked about that. So while people are talking about banning DEI and CRT and all this other stuff, it's like, I just want another alternative to be out there so people to hear it. So these corporations are bringing Kendi and all these people in to speak to their staff. And so I'm working on a panel to go out and, the business roundtable and all that. And to these CEOs you spoke to saying, you're getting the pressure to push this stuff out there. But if you allow other people to say, so you bring in Kendi, I'm not telling you not to bring Kendi in, but bring in Ian Rowe and let him talk about the alternatives. And because we tend to talk about solutions and things you can actually do.
Right.
So do you think, I'm going to try it anyway, but do you think those CEOs with the leadership and courage being the topic, that if given this opportunity, that some of them will be open to allowing you to come in and speak, not from a political standpoint, just, you're concerned about an issue, I'm concerned about an issue. Kendi gave you one solution. We want to offer another one. Can we talk to your staff?
So not only do I think they'd be interested, I think most CEOs are desperate for empowering alternatives that genuinely affect opportunity for kids. It's, again, many of my conversations go like that, I got to do X, my staff is saying X, Black Lives Matter is giving me an easy on-ramp, and then I can check the box, and the social media mob will leave me alone, right? And so, but there are, very powerful folks like Irshad Manji, hopefully she's watching, there are folks like Chloe Valdery, who are offering empowering alternatives where, again, you can fight bigotry without spreading bigotry. I think that's Chloe's line. I think you can create opportunities, especially in education. So I think most CEOs, and I've spent a lot of time in the last year, want this. They want this.
Well, I think that's really important. We need to try to make that happen because I talk about the business roundtable because you have some of the biggest CEOs of the biggest companies, 3M, Jamie Dimon, Walmart, and all those, and they're bringing these people in. So, which is fine. It's like, what about us? What about Bob Woodson? What about Ian? What about Will? I'll come, and just talk about, that's fine. Not putting anyone down, right? Just saying there's other ways to solve these problems. Let's hear them out. And there's got to be people on your staff who would love to hear it, but we need the opportunity.
Right, and Will was, debunking some of these myths, like for example, about the racial wealth gap, and like all this data. If you only look through the prism of race, you see this negative story. But when you take into account just a few other simple factors, like, maybe there are other things that can contribute to overall societal wealth, and the more that business leaders themselves actually have that data, they don't have to feel cowered into like, well, actually, it's about information propagation as well.
Yep.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Is that good?